Okay. So welcome, I'm Joe Luff, and this is the Theology of Karl Marx coming to you live from the C. Robbins Clark Library at St. Mark's Episcopal Church in Berkeley. To access the seminar syllabus, migrate to newconsensus.org syllabus. There you will find links to all our readings as well as to links to the first 6 seminars. To learn more, you can email me at josephluff@gmail.com. Our thesis is that Karl Marx erected his critique of modern society around the scaffolding of G.W.F. Hegel's incarnational theology. Christianity is a deeply material spiritual formation centered upon the incarnate God, the Palestinian Jew, Jesus. How could it be otherwise? With the turn of the last millennium, however, Christians began to distance themselves from the material character of their faith. They abandoned Christianity's surface forms of appearance, including the body of their Lord, replacing it with the abstract value form of the commodity. This gave rise to a religious formation far better equipped to survive and thrive in a society where social relations are mediated by commodity production and exchange. Martin Luther celebrated Deus absconditus, the hidden God. Pietists such as Philip Jakob Spener warned Christians not to trust any outward form of appearance, not creeds or confessions, not the Bible, not prayer, not the Holy Eucharist, not even the body of their Lord. Awakening preachers such as Jonathan Edwards celebrated the mortification of the flesh among the spiritually awakened. Christian hostility toward surface forms of appearance left surfaces vulnerable to widespread depredations. Creation proved especially vulnerable, but so too did the bodies of Africans, of women, of the colonized, the poor, the dependent, children, and workers. A Christianity that celebrated an abstract God offered no protection against a social formation bent on extracting the most value from every surface. Officially sanctioned mass death expanded exponentially. Christian thinkers counted the rapid expansion of death and destruction as evidence of God's presence, the presence of eternity in time. They called this violent presence the sublime. Not all Christians were satisfied with this isolation of their God from the material world. In his Phenomenology of the Spirit, G.W.F. Hegel offered Christians an alternative, an incarnate God. In creation, God differentiated God's self from God's self. God created an other, the creation that is not God, but that belongs in relationship with God. God wills this independent, free other to become aware. God wants this other to know itself, to know its world, and to know its creator. World history is the field where this happens, not in an instant, not magically, but through experience over time. Hegel described a process where God alienates and objectifies God's self in things. God differentiates God's self from God's self in creation. Creation over time returns to God, complete and whole. But this is not all. So thorough is God's identification with creation that God becomes a specific human being, the Palestinian Jew, Jesus of Nazareth. Last week, we examined how Karl Marx used and transformed Hegel's incarnational theology in his critique of modern society. The very young Marx simply transferred the attributes Hegel had ascribed to God to the industrial working class. Following the resounding defeat of the revolutions of 1848 and 49, however, Marx experienced a crisis of faith And in the late 1850s, he abandoned his earlier belief in the industrial working class. Class still played a central role. It still does. But it is not the driving force of history. In its place, Marx substituted the abstract value form of the commodity. It was not God's spirit that had alienated and differentiated itself in history. Hegel was wrong. Nor was it God's spirit that was returning to itself restored and complete. But nor was it the industrial working class. Rather, was it the abstract value form of the commodity that drove history forward, differentiating itself from itself, expanding, and returning to itself again for another round of creation. Today, we are looking at how the mature Karl Marx used and transformed Hegel's incarnational theology in his critique of modern society. Is there a question there? Okay. Analytically, the step from last week to this is not very large. Conceptually, however, it is huge. This is because anyone raised in our society over the last 500 years will have from birth experienced what I would call history's directional dynamism. History is moving, it is changing, it is unfolding, not randomly, not haphazardly. History appears to be progressing rationally. Economists will tell us why this is so. It is because the aim of all investment is to expand the investor's marginal product, to expand value. Innovation expands an investor's marginal product. But no sooner has my innovation won me more value, but it is quickly adopted by other producers. This creates a new floor for all producers. When do you stop innovating? You can't, or else you will fall behind. This compulsion to innovate and expand the marginal product is the source of history's directional dynamism. Where is it going? It is ever moving toward bigger, better, faster, cheaper, more effective, more appealing, onwards and upwards, forward. Clearly, however, this historical logic only holds true in a society driven by abstract value. If non-capitalist societies appeared as though they were going nowhere, that is because these societies, in fact, were going nowhere. Nevertheless, it is still difficult for us to conceptualize what life must feel like in a society where directionally dynamic change is missing. We experience time as the constant, the blank envelope, as it were, the frame in which things take place. Yet for 2.4 million years, hominids experienced time as a fellow creature, ebbing and flowing, lingering, expanding and contracting, punctuated, beginning, ending, appearing, and passing. Time as we experience it has occupied less than 1% of human history. But unless we attempt to reach around behind this experience, we cannot expect to understand the terrible fix we have gotten ourselves in. According to Marx, we are living in the end times. We are careening forward into oblivion. We call this wild abandon progress, but it is in fact perdition. To see why this is so, we need to appreciate the complete novelty of the commodity form, a material form of appearance whose value arises not from the substances out of which things are composed, but from the abstract time consumed in their composition. As we saw in an earlier seminar, economists describe this relationship as the marginal product of labor. And we saw a slide, I think it was in session 3, from Paul Krugman's common textbook that showed MPL equals delta Q over delta L. The marginal product of labor equals a change in quantity over a change in labor. And a more accurate rendition would also add a change in capital, including intellectual capital, human capital, all kinds of different capital. But here's the problem. The marginal product measures the efficiency of capital and labor. It tells me how much more I am producing for less labor, less capital, more whatever. The marginal product is a ratio. It is silent on the most vital piece of information we need today. That is, how to produce not more, but less. It is silent on this information because the commodity form is explicitly hostile to the material world. It is explicitly hostile to bodies. That was already clear in seminar 3 when we observed the transformation of Mary and her son's bodies in sacred iconography beginning in the 13th century. It was clear when we followed Francis Bacon's advice to the king to ravage the face of the earth. It was clear from John Locke's interpretation of the book of Genesis and his application of the book of Genesis to the new world, new in quotation marks. It was clear in Abigail Hutchinson's body and the bodies of all the awakened. And it was clear in a Christianity that had completely abandoned divine materiality. This ends badly. It ends with the apocalypse. We are living in the end times, and Marx tells us why. The end is coming because we have lost the capacity to decipher the value of surface forms of appearance. The meanings of these surfaces have become opaque. Quote, the commodity is, first of all, Marx writes, an external object, a thing which through its qualities satisfies human needs of whatever kind. The nature of these needs, whether they arise, for example, from the stomach or the imagination, makes no difference. Marx no longer espoused a crude utilitarianism. The usefulness of a commodity could be as much the nutrition it supplies as the beauty of its appearance on the plate. But, writes Marx, in the form of society to be considered here, that is capitalist societies, commodities, quote, are also the material bearers of exchange value. Commodities are surface forms of appearance that derive their value from their relationships to other commodities, not from the substances out of which they are composed. This renders the commodity's surface enigmatic. Quote, a commodity appears at first sight an extremely obvious, trivial thing, but its analysis brings out that it is a very strange thing, abounding in metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties. On its surface, it is what it appears to be, but, writes Marx, as soon as it emerges as a commodity, it changes into a thing which transcends sensuousness. Are there any questions or observations or points that need emphasizing? Okay, if not, then I want to pause just for a moment here, because to point out here that it is odd that Marx thinks that this is theological. The commodity transcends sensuousness. Now recall what happened to the body of Christ in the new millennium. Recall what happened to his mother's body. Their bodies became completely enigmatic. They became things that transcended sensuousness. They became commodities. Quote, the mystical character of the commodity does not therefore arise from its use value, whence then arises the enigmatic character of the product of labor as soon as it assumes the form of a commodity. Clearly, it arises from this form, the commodity form itself. The equality of the kinds of human labor takes on a physical form in the equal objectivity of the products of labor as values. So the quote continues, but I want to just nail that down. Things are not equal. Things are qualitatively different from one another. They substantively are different from one another. And yet, within commodity societies, they are equivalents. They are identical. They are related at the level of value. So to continue, the measure of the expenditure of human labor power by its duration takes on the form of the magnitude of the value of the products of labor. So we've switched from substantive value to the value of things in terms of the time consumed in their composition. And finally, the relationships between the producers within which the social characteristics of the labors are manifested take on the form of a social relation between the products of labor. End quote. We now relate to one another, to our God, and to our world through the prism of the commodity form. Everything, even things that are not things, have value only in this convoluted, grotesque form. Quote, the mysterious character of the commodity form consists, therefore, simply in the fact that the commodity reflects the social characteristics of men's own labor as objective characteristics of the products of labor themselves, as the socio-natural properties of these things. End quote. We look at ourselves, at our God, at our world, and we see value, or we see nothing. Abstract value now appears natural to us, normal, inevitable. Quote, the products of labor have become commodities, sensuous things which are at the same time supersensible or social. The commodity form and the value relation of the products of labor within which it appears have absolutely no connection with the physical nature of the commodity and the material relations arising out of this. It is nothing but the definite social relation between human beings themselves, which assumes here, for them, that is, for us, the fantastic form of a relation between things. End quote. But there's more. In order, therefore, to find an analogy, we must take flight into the misty realm of religion. We already have. But not any religion. Christianity in particular, and not all Christianity, but modern Christianity. Here's Marx. Quote, for a society of commodity producers whose general social relation of production consists in the fact that they treat their products as commodities, hence as values, and in this material form bring their individual private labors into relation with each other as homogeneous human labor, that is not differentiated substantively, but by their abstract time, homogeneous human labor, Christianity, with its cult of man in the abstract, more particularly in its bourgeois development, i.e., in Protestantism, deism, etc., is the most fitting form of religion. The most fitting form of religion. Not first century Christianity, not 4th or 5th century or 6th century Christianity, not the Christianity of Gregory or Thomas, but Protestantism, deism, with their cult of man in the abstract. Which man? Well, Jesus, of course. But it's Jesus isolated from his material form of appearance, isolated from his body, or as I have elsewhere referred to him, Christ the commodity. To pull this metaphor forward, we have become sleepwalkers. We no longer see things as they are. But for this reason, we are largely oblivious to the profoundly, deeply destructive thing we are party to, the complete annihilation of God's creation. Or if we are aware, we scarcely know how or what we should do. There is, however, a logic built into the commodity that may help us gain our bearings. The material world, after all, has not disappeared, even if we do not see it. Our bodies are still there, even though we have done all we can to drug, deaden, and mortify our flesh. And the substantive value of the material world, although gagged and bound, has also not disappeared. Most of the time, we can safely ignore the material world. God knows that Christians have over the past half millennium. But creation is irrepressible, and eventually it will assert itself against the violence we have done to it. And if we are attentive, we will notice creation fighting back, because abstract value and substantive value are not the same thing. Indeed, abstract value aims at the destruction of substantive value. So here's how Marx put it, quote, to say that these mutually independent and antithetical processes form an internal unity under capitalism is to say also that their internal unity moves forward through external antitheses. Abstract value expands at the expense of substantive value, but it also requires substantive value. It requires things to bear it forward. Quote, these two processes lack internal independence because they complement each other. Hence, if the assertion of their external independence proceeds to a certain critical point, their unity violently makes itself felt by producing a crisis. End quote. Formally, human beings lived for 2.4 million years without fossil fuels, without industrial agriculture, without the industrial slaughter of other sentient creatures solely to expand the marginal product of investors. Now we must live sustainably, or our planet will die. We have no choice. But were we tomorrow to stop drilling, stop slaughtering, and start living sustainably, millions of lives would be lost. There would be social and political chaos. The entire globe would be thrown into turmoil. Why? Because we have created a social formation that is based upon abstract value. If the assertion of their external independence proceeds to a certain critical point, their unity violently makes itself felt by producing a crisis. Well, such as energy wars rippling across the globe, such as extreme weather events, such as a worldwide crisis of governance, such as famine, such as pandemics. The material world is fighting back. And we either see it or we don't. Quote.
Hello, Joe.
Yeah?
So when he says we should, when you are talking about living sustainably, how should that be?
Yeah. How does that happen?
Yeah.
I think it's a good question, Gilbert. And there are lots of proposals on the table. Okay. But imagine, for example, in neighboring Nigeria, if all of a sudden all the oil fields were shut down.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Nigeria would be thrown into chaos.
Yeah.
As with the rest of, Western Africa.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, on some level, it would be a really good thing to shut down all those oil fields. But on the other hand, we are absolutely dependent on them.
Yes, we are.
Yeah, right. Go ahead.
But then sometimes when it comes to issues of sustainability, people's perceptions differ. And a lot of people think that, well, when we are talking of sustainability, we are talking about maybe the life today and then thinking about the life of the future. But then sometimes it happens that the kind of thing that we think that we are doing to sustain our lives are also the very things that are destroying lives.
Yeah, I absolutely. And so we need to think critically about this. One of the things that Marx is pointing out, I think, is that a first step in this direction is simply recognizing the difference between abstract value and substantive value.
Okay.
And to at least begin to make decisions that reflect and respect the substantive value of things. The integrity of the material world.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. But for Christians, this has a particular meaning, because for 500 years we've done everything we can to suppress the substantive value of God. Right? We 500 years ago, Jesus was a material human being who we were happy to profess in the Nicene Creed and the Chalcedon Standard. And increasingly over the last 500 years, we can't imagine a God who is material. In fact, we run the opposite direction. And it could be that our rejection of God's materiality has everything to do with our embrace of capitalism, but also our embrace of a disembodied God.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. But I think you're right. I don't think there's a simple solution here. Anything else?
No, I'm okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So, quote, there is an antithesis, Marx continues, immanent in the commodity between use value and value, between private labor, which simultaneously counts as merely abstract universal labor, between the conversion of things into person and the conversion of persons into things. The antithetical phases of the metamorphosis of the commodity are the developed forms of motion of this immanent contradiction. So there are two things that we can notice here, and maybe there are three things. The contradiction here is not between private ownership or the relations of production and the socialized forces of production. They're not between the bourgeoisie and the industrial working class. The contradiction is immanent to the commodity form itself, between its surface form of appearance and its underlying abstract value form. It is this contradiction that, according to Marx, generates the crisis. These forms, therefore, imply the possibility of crises, though no more than the possibility, writes Marx in 1867. Can we now say that there is a crisis here, given all the things that we can see around the world and in the world? Do we see this contradiction? Well, maybe not. Even though all creation is crying out for us to pay attention, we are very much like sleepwalkers. We are oblivious. Marx does offer a way forward, but if we do not see the problem, it is difficult to see or even want to see the solution. So, one solution is technology itself. Technology imagines that our problem is technical. We need to eliminate our dependence on fossil fuels. We need to reduce our global footprint. But rather than listening attentively to what creation is telling us, we should instead further suppress creation by applying another layer of technology. Here's how it works. The public needs to invest in technologies that increase the efficiency of labor and capital. Over time, these efficiencies will reduce human input to a bare minimum, freeing human beings to pursue aims more appropriate to their dignity and status. This is how Hegel put it back in 1820, over 200 years ago. Quote, the universal and objective element in work lies in the abstracting process which affects the subdivision of needs and means and thereby eo ipso subdivides production and brings about the division of labor. But this division, the work of the individual, becomes less complex, and consequently his skill at his section of the job increases like his output. At the same time, the subtraction of one man's skill and means of production from another's completes and makes necessary everywhere the dependence of men on one another and their reciprocal relation in the satisfaction of their other needs. He's simply describing the division of labor. Further, the abstraction of one man's production from another's makes work more and more mechanical until finally man is able to step aside and install machines in his place, and we're all free. The pursuit of the marginal product of delta Q over delta L is the source of freedom, freedom from work. Look at the history of production from 1800 to the present. A 12-hour workday and six-day week give way to a 10-hour day and a 6-day week, which gives way to an 8-hour workday and a 5-day work week. And there are now even demands for a 4-day work week, all of which is made possible only through ever greater efficiency and ever increasing marginal product. Three problems. First, workers spilled oceans of blood before investors yielded to even an 8-hour day, never mind a 4-hour workday. The 8-hour workday was not the natural product of investors pursuing an ever greater marginal product. Workers had to demand and fight for the 8-hour workday and healthcare and old age pension and workers' comp and disability insurance. It was not the marginal product that gave them these things. Second, however, these benefits have fallen to workers in first world countries, and even then, only if you are of the right race, the right ethnicity, the right religion, and the right gender. Step over the border into Mexico or Nicaragua or Honduras or Guatemala or India or Pakistan or Albania or Algeria. Step over the border and it is an entirely different matter. But third, since the marginal product is a ratio, it is always returning to one. In order to expand the marginal product, investors must continue to innovate ad infinitum, ad nauseum. Besides, if no one is working, as Hegel contemplates, if no one is working, how will anyone purchase what machines make? Will investors give them the money to purchase their own product? No strings attached? Well, there's your marginal product right out the window. Hegel was dreaming. So let's try again. Let us say that the real problem is not technological, but is with the way we measure value. Since the 14th century, we have measured value in equal units of abstract time. This way of measuring value has produced more stuff than at any other time in history. That is how the marginal product works, more with less. Now let us say we measure value substantively. There is value in good health, in a good meal, good wine, a long walk, story time, discovery time, friends, family, security, rest, leisure, laughter. Our tendency is to immediately leap forward and think of ways to maximize these goods. But stop yourself. That is the pathway to perdition. Take a step back. For 2.4 million years, hominids valued things substantively. For 1,000 years, Christians valued their God substantively. This problem has no technical solution. The solution is in how we measure value. So tucked away toward the end of volume 3 of Capital, more than 900 pages in, where no true believer will have taken the time or effort to look, we find the following reflection from Marx. And in fact, this was a section that was published only after Marx's death, and it was compiled by Engels. But as far as we can tell, the manuscript was in Marx's hand, so we put it there in volume 3. Quote, "The realm of freedom really begins only where labor determined by necessity and external expediency ends. It lies by its very nature beyond the sphere of material production." What about the workers' state? And what about the next 5-year plan? Freedom begins where labor ends. Quote, "Just as members of the first communities had to wrestle with nature to satisfy their needs, to maintain and reproduce their lives, so we must. And we must do so in all forms of society and under all possible modes of production," i.e., Hegel was dreaming. This realm of natural necessity expands with our development because our needs also expand. So we are back in a vicious cycle. Or are we? Quote, "Freedom in this sphere can consist only in this, that we govern our relationship with nature in a rational way, weighing together its best use instead of being dominated by it as a blind power, accomplishing this with the least expenditure of energy and in conditions most worthy and appropriate for our human nature," which I translate as "do it sustainably." But this will always remain the sphere of necessity. The true realm of freedom, the development of human capacities as ends in themselves, this begins beyond the realm of necessity, although it can only flourish with this realm of necessity as its basis. The solution. What's the solution? If our way of valuing things is at fault, how should we value things? But that is not the right question, says Marx. If we predicate the shortening of the workday on efficiency, then it is clear that we are aiming at a moving target, a target that is always receding over the horizon. The only way that we can possibly reduce the working day is through efficiency. So we create a much more efficient production system, which then equals 1 again, the ratio, and producers need to make more than 1. So we're constantly chasing this mirage. Instead, we need to predicate efficiency on the shortening of the workday. In economic terms, we need to claw back the efficiencies we have already produced, reallocating these efficiencies to the things we have reason to value: good health, good friends, good food, good wine, time with family, learning, creativity, leisure, security, rest, love, all of the rest. The reduction of the working day, writes Marx, is the basic prerequisite. That is the solution. We need to value things not for their marginal product, but substantively for what they are. Now, obviously, or maybe not so obviously, this has huge theological implications. What if we valued Christ not for his abstract, universal, cosmic being, not for his power and might? What if we valued Christ for his body, for his life, death, and resurrection? What if we valued God for God's substantive engagement with and relationship, both to us and to all of creation? If the modern era introduced a Christ completely foreign to the church's ecumenical creeds, what would it mean to rediscover Christ's body? What difference would that make? And I'm going to pause here. Are there any questions, suggestions, disagreements?
No.
Yeah.
Hello, Joe. Can you hear me?
Okay.
Hello, Joe. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. So, Joe, when you say that freedom ends where labor starts, is that right? Because I think I heard that
Well,
statement.
he actually says the opposite of that. He says that
Said that
freedom begins where labor ends.
freedom begins where labor ends.
Yeah.
What does that mean? So does that mean that at the point that there is no labor, there is freedom?
Yes.
Okay.
Almost by definition, because labor by definition is driven by necessity.
Okay.
Right. And so when we stop work,
Then
not because we're unemployed, but we stop work because we're finished, then we will do things that are not necessary.
yeah, but then if in a context, let's say if I personally decide to stop work,
Yes.
then somebody can say that where my freedom has started, where my labor has ended, because it is my decision to stop working. But when somebody is laid off,
Yes.
then in that case, I don't know whether we can say that that person's freedom has started. Because if the
Well,
person is laid off, I mean, it is not because.
I think that person is definitely free, but they've got other problems.
Yeah.
Right. So Marx is imagining a world that is sufficiently productive and is, as he puts it, we are together governing our relationship with creation rationally and thoughtfully and sustainably. There is plenty of product to go around for all of us. And then we can think about, well, what are we going to do when we're not working? Well, so much of our time is driven not by doing things that for their own sake, but doing things for the production of value. Even when we're not working, we have that leisure to not work because we have worked. If we've decided, that we can take some free time. In the world that Marx is imagining, when we have enough, we can stop working. We're not producing value, we're producing things. And we value things, not abstract value. And if we can begin to pivot towards the material world, towards materiality, we can also begin to see how we are driven by an abstract compulsion not to satisfy our needs or even to satisfy our wants, but an abstract compulsion to produce ever more value.
Okay, all right. I get you. Okay, well.
Yeah. And what I'm suggesting is that it was with the birth of capitalism in the 14th century that also our experience of God began to change. We began to look with suspicion on divine materiality, on God's material presence among us. And that's consistent with the capitalist social formation.
So Joe, if I understand that word, then it means more capitalism affects our relationship with God, or the
Yes,
way we see God, isn't it?
and the world and one another.
And one another, and the way we see things, yeah. So it affects our values per se, isn't it?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And where for me this is most clear theologically is that we can no longer in good conscience recite the Chalcedon standard of the Nicene Creed and also embrace the cosmic Christ, right? I mean, the cosmic Christ, this Christ without a body,
Yeah.
is not the God of Chalcedon or Nicaea.
Okay.
Yeah.
But the point is, from when I look at our society today, I am just wondering whether we'll be able to do away with capitalism. Yeah.
Well, I mean, on some level, I mean that's a really important question, and it's something to contemplate strategically, and tactically. But for Christians, it on another level hardly makes a difference, because we need to recover something approximating the God of Chalcedon and Nicaea in any case. We need to begin to think really clearly and embrace divine materiality. And I would suggest that once Christians do that, or even some small number of Christians do that, the consequences could be revolutionary.
Yeah, Joe, yes, because I see it from that sense. But the point is that our society is becoming more and more secular. I mean, it is now, let me put it that way. It is much more secular than and every day it is becoming secular. And Christian ideas and Christian values are more or less sublimed. And so people are no longer even giving priority to things of Christianity. And so the
Right.
Christian space is becoming smaller and smaller. And that is where the challenge is. And that is where the
So,
difficulty is.
so is there a discourse? Is there a dialogue that we can have with non-Christians, and including, atheists, to say we are with you, at least in this way? We're with you in recovering the substantive value of things. Because my experience is that Christians are almost universally on the wrong side of this issue, even though they should be on the right side.
That is the point. That is the point.
Right? So maybe we can make common cause with Muslims and with Buddhists and with Hindus and with Native Americans and with people who have no belief at all, maybe we can make common cause with them because we have a shared story about materiality. Yeah?
Yeah, yeah.
But first, we as Christians would need to develop that story, that narrative. And I think that narrative is deeply rooted in our faith if we choose to recover it.
Yeah, I think yes, that really makes sense.
Yeah. It's kind of, the good news. It's the gospel.
Yeah.
Right? If there's nothing else for us here and now, next week, which is our last session, I'm going to try to piece through and I hope with your assistance piece back together something approximating the theology of Karl Marx.
Okay. All right.
Okay.
Okay.
Great. Thanks a
All right.
lot, Gilbert.
All right. Thank you, Joe. All right.
Yeah.
Okay. So see you next week. Yeah.
Yeah. Bye.
All right. Bye.
Thanks, Tom.
Yes, thank you. Peace. Best.
Peace.
Bye.